Sarah Martinez sat alone at the corner table in the cafeteria, her lunch tray barely touched as she watched the familiar scene unfold. 3 tables away was leading his usual crew in their daily entertainment at her expense. Today's performance involved exaggerated mimicry of her quiet demeanor, complete with theatrical whispers and mock fearful glances. "Look at her," said loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Silent Sarah strikes again. I bet she's never even talked to another human being." His friends erupted in laughter, and several other students turned to look at Sarah with varying degrees of amusement and pity. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around her plastic fork, but her expression remained unchanged. She had learned long ago that reactions only fed their hunger for drama. What none of them knew was that she had spent the last 3 years of her life in places where silence meant survival, where the wrong word could mean death not just for herself, but for entire civilizations. The memory of 442B flashed through her mind unbidden. The crystalline cities of the Empire had gleamed like jewels against the purple sky, their inhabitants living in peace for over 10,000 years until the Devourers arrived. She had been just 14 when the United Earth Defense Corps recruited her, not for her physical prowess or tactical genius, but for something far more rare and valuable. Sarah was what the military classified as a Class A, one of fewer than 50 humans in existence capable of learning and speaking alien languages through direct neural interface. While other soldiers carried weapons, Sarah carried the weight of communication between species, the responsibility of preventing wars through words rather than violence. The laughter from his table grew louder as he stood up, clearly preparing for another performance. Sarah watched him with eyes that had seen the aftermath of failed negotiations, had witnessed what happened when communication broke down between species capable of reducing planets to ash. "Hey, Sarah," called out, abandoning all pretense of subtlety. "Earth to Sarah, do you actually speak, or did they forget to install your voice box?" His audience loved it, their laughter echoing off the cafeteria walls. Sarah remembered the first time she had spoken to a council member, how her voice had trembled not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that billions of lives hung on her ability to find the right words. They communicated through harmonic frequencies that most humans couldn't even hear, let alone reproduce. It had taken her 3 months of constant neural conditioning to master their language, 3 months during which she rarely spoke to anyone in her native tongue. "Maybe she's an alien," suggested Jenny's girlfriend and second in command of their little cruelty brigade. "That would explain why she's so weird." More laughter followed, and Sarah noticed other students beginning to pull out their phones, ready to record whatever humiliation had planned next. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had indeed lived among aliens, had shared meals with beings whose biology was so foreign that breathing the same air required complex life support systems. She had earned the respect of warrior poets whose honor codes were older than human civilization, had been granted audiences with hive-mind entities that spoke in colors rather than sounds. On sea, she had spent 8 months with the ethereal collective, beings of pure energy who had initially viewed humans as nothing more than primitive biological constructs. Through patience and careful translation of philosophical concepts that had no human equivalent, she had convinced them to share their advanced medical technology. That technology now saved millions of human lives annually, though the general public would never know the true source of their miraculous new treatments. Was approaching her table now, his confidence buoyed by his audience's attention. "Come on, Silent Sarah, just one word, prove you're actually human." He stopped directly across from her, leaning forward with his hands planted on her table. Sarah looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his with a steadiness that made him unconsciously take a small step back. In those eyes, had he known how to look, he might have seen the same calm that had faced down the wrath of Altair 7, a being of living flame whose anger could incinerate starships. During the Altair crisis, Sarah had been the only human who could survive long enough in the entity's presence to communicate with it. The wrath spoke in heat signatures and electromagnetic pulses, a language that literally burned through standard translation equipment. Sarah had submitted to experimental biotechnological implants that allowed her to process and respond to thermal communication, enduring pain that would have killed most people just to prevent a war that would have consumed 3 solar systems. "I'm talking to you," pressed, his voice taking on an edge of irritation at her continued silence. The cafeteria had grown quieter, more students turning to watch the confrontation. "What's wrong with you? Are you stupid or just stuck up?" Sarah's mind drifted to the peace negotiations on Europa Station, where she had served as the primary translator between the aggressive Confederacy and the pacifist Harmony worlds. The valued strength above all else, and initially refused to negotiate with what they saw as a young, weak flesh. It had taken Sarah 3 days of linguistic combat, matching their verbal aggression with perfectly crafted insults in their own language, to earn enough respect for them to listen to the peace proposals. The Harmony worlds, by contrast, communicated through shared emotional experiences, requiring Sarah to open her mind to their collective consciousness. The process had left her unable to speak for weeks afterward, her neural pathways overwhelmed by the alien thoughts and feelings that had flooded through her. "Fine," said, straightening up with theatrical disappointment. "Stay weird, Sarah. I'm sure you'll make lots of friends in the real world with that attitude." He turned to walk back to his table, but something made him pause and look back. "You know what? I bet you've never even been outside this town. Probably never will either." The comment hit closer to home than could have imagined, but not in the way he intended. Sarah had been outside not just the town, but the entire solar system. She had seen the birth of new stars and the death of ancient civilizations. She had walked on worlds where gravity flowed upward and time moved in spirals, had breathed atmospheres that turned thoughts into visible light. But she had also paid a price for these experiences that no 16-year-old should have to bear. The neural modifications that allowed her to communicate with alien species had left her with chronic pain and periodic seizures that the military classified as acceptable side effects. The psychological trauma of carrying the responsibility for preventing interstellar wars had given her nightmares that no Earth-based therapist could hope to understand. Most difficult of all was the isolation. The classified nature of her work meant she could never share her experiences with anyone who hadn't been cleared for cosmic-level security. Her parents believed she attended an advanced private school for gifted students. Her few friends from childhood had long since given up trying to maintain contact with someone who disappeared for months at a time without explanation. As returned to his table to accept congratulations for his performance, Sarah finished her lunch in continued silence. Around her, the normal rhythms of teenage life continued, students complaining about homework and gossiping about relationships, their biggest concerns centered on weekend plans and college applications. Sarah them their normalcy, even as she knew she could never be part of it. She had seen too much, experienced too much, sacrificed too much. The girl who had learned to speak in colors and think in frequencies could never quite fit back into a world where the biggest challenge was remembering locker combinations. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, and students began gathering their belongings. Sarah remained seated for a moment longer, watching her classmates hurry past her table without a second glance. Tomorrow would bring another day of entertainment, another round of whispered comments and pointed stares. What none of them realized was that their mockery couldn't touch her. She had faced down cosmic horrors and prevented galactic wars. She had earned the respect of beings who could reshape reality with a thought. She had stood in the presence of godlike entities and emerged with her humanity intact. A group of students lingered near the cafeteria doors, glancing back at Sarah and whispering among themselves. She recognized the look, the mixture of curiosity and social uncertainty that came with wanting to understand someone who didn't fit the normal patterns. Emma, a quiet girl from Sarah's chemistry class, seemed to be working up the courage to approach. She took a few steps towards Sarah's table, her friends watching with anticipation. Sarah met her gaze briefly, and Emma froze, seeing something in those dark eyes that she couldn't identify, but that made her instinctively step back toward the safety of her group. Sarah gathered her things and headed to her next class, leaving behind another table of students who would never know how close they had come to speaking with someone who had literally helped save their world. The irony followed her down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in rhythm with memories of alien worlds and the constant ache of secrets that could never be shared. The harassment escalated 3 weeks later when discovered social media. Sarah's phone buzzed during third-period biology as notifications flooded her screen. Someone had created a fake profile in her name, complete with ridiculous posts about talking to imaginary aliens and claiming to be a secret government agent. The comments section was brutal, filled with her classmates sharing the joke and adding their own cruel observations about her antisocial behavior. By lunchtime, the fake profile had spread throughout the school's social network. Students Sarah barely knew were pointing at her in the hallways, whispering and laughing. had outdone himself, and he knew it, sitting at his usual table with a satisfied smirk as he watched his handiwork unfold. Sarah stared at her phone screen, reading post after post that mocked her silence, her isolation, her apparent delusions of grandeur. The cruel irony burned in her chest. They had accidentally stumbled closer to the truth than they could possibly imagine, turning her genuine experiences into a joke that the entire school could share. During the siege of Wolf 359, she had indeed spoken to what humans might consider imaginary beings. The Phantom Collective existed partially outside normal spacetime, their physical forms visible only through specialized sensors. Communication required Sarah to partially phase-shift her consciousness, a process that left her disoriented and nauseous for days afterward. The Phantoms had been humanity's first truly alien contact, beings whose logic was so foreign that initial negotiations had resulted in 3 diplomatic teams suffering complete psychological breakdowns. Sarah, at barely 15, had been the first human to successfully establish meaningful communication with them. Her success had prevented a war that would have made the destruction of entire star systems seem like minor skirmishes. "Hey everyone," announced loudly as Sarah entered the cafeteria. "Secret Agent Sarah is here. Better hide your alien secrets." The laughter was immediate and widespread, students throughout the room turning to look at her with renewed interest in the spectacle. Sarah moved through the lunch line mechanically, her enhanced hearing picking up fragments of conversation from every table. The military modifications that allowed her to process alien languages had the unfortunate side effect of making her hypersensitive to human speech patterns. She could hear the cruel excitement in their voices, the mob mentality that turned ordinary teenagers into a pack of predators. "I heard she actually believes it," someone whispered 2 tables away. "Like she actually thinks she talks to aliens." "Maybe she's schizophrenic," suggested another voice. "My mom's a nurse, and she says that's when it usually starts showing up." The comments stung more than they should have. Sarah had extensive psychological evaluation before and after every mission, with Earth's Best confirming her mental stability despite the extreme nature of her experiences. But hearing her classmates casually diagnose her with mental illness based on fabricated posts felt like a violation of something deeper than her privacy. She sat at her usual corner table, trying to block out the continuing commentary when her phone buzzed with a priority message. The sender code made her blood run cold. Cosmic clearance required. Immediate response necessary. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the message. The contact crisis had entered Phase 3. Her linguistic expertise was needed immediately. A transport would arrive at the designated coordinates in 6 hours. They were unlike any species humanity had previously encountered. They communicated through controlled quantum entanglement, their thoughts existing simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes. Previous attempts at contact had resulted in the complete destruction of 2 research stations when translation errors caused reality distortions that collapsed local spacetime. Sarah was the only human who had successfully interfaced with communication without suffering permanent neural damage. The process required her to temporarily expand her consciousness across 11 dimensions, experiencing existence from perspectives that human brains were never meant to process. "Earth to Sarah's voice cut through her racing thoughts. He had moved to the table directly next to hers, his phone held up in obvious recording mode. "Looks like Agent Sarah just got another mission from her alien buddies. What do they want this time? Peace talks with the lunch meat." His audience roared with laughter, and Sarah realized that half the cafeteria was now recording the scene. Her moment of visible distress had been interpreted as a reaction to their mockery, rather than the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. Sarah looked up with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. In 6 hours, she would be leaving Earth again, possibly for months, to prevent a conflict that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. And here stood this boy, this child who had never seen beyond the boundaries of his small world, mocking experiences that had shaped the future of human existence. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls around her emotions cracked. The isolation, the pain, the constant burden of secrets that could never be shared, all of it crystallized into a single point of white-hot frustration. "You want to know about aliens?" Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed cafeteria. It was the first time most of her classmates had ever heard her speak, and the novelty was enough to command attention. His grin widened. He had finally gotten a reaction, and his phone was capturing every second. "Oh, this is good. Please enlighten us, Agent Sarah. Tell us about your secret missions." Sarah stood slowly, her enhanced reflexes making the movement fluid despite the tremor in her hands. Around the cafeteria, students leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "You think you know what fear looks like," Sarah continued, her voice still quiet but carrying an undertone that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You think your little games and your cruel words represent some kind of power." The neural implants in her skull began to warm as emotional stress triggered their defensive protocols. Sarah could feel the translation matrices activating, her brain automatically shifting into combat-ready linguistic mode. "I've seen fear," she said, and now her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords, subtle frequencies that made the windows vibrate slightly. "I've seen what happens when civilizations that have existed for millions of years face extinction in a single moment." His grin faltered slightly. There was something in Sarah's tone, something in her posture that his hindbrain recognized as genuinely dangerous. But he was committed to his performance now, with dozens of phones recording his triumph. "Cool story," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Maybe you should write a book about your imaginary adventures." Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle change in his heart rate. The slight tremor in his breathing that indicated his fight-or-flight response was beginning to activate. Her classmates might not consciously recognize the predatory stillness that had settled over her, but their primitive instincts were starting to send warning signals. "3 years ago," Sarah said, her voice now carrying undertones from languages that had never been spoken on Earth, "I stood in the council chambers of the Empire as their capital city burned around us. The Devourers had broken through their defenses, beings of pure consumption that turn entire worlds into empty husks within hours." The cafeteria had grown completely silent. Students who had been laughing moments before now sat frozen, caught between skepticism and a growing sense that something was very wrong with this situation. "The High Chancellor looked at me," Sarah continued. "This being whose species had mastered interstellar travel before humans learned to make fire, and asked me to explain why his people should die for creatures they had never met." Took a small step backward, his phone still recording but his hand now visibly shaking. "Sarah, you're starting to freak people out. Maybe you should sit down." "I told him," Sarah said, ignoring his comment entirely, "about a species called humanity. About how we had learned to find hope in impossible circumstances, to fight for others even when fighting for ourselves seemed pointless. I told him about human children who gave their lunch money to help strangers, about soldiers who died protecting people they would never meet." The temperature in the cafeteria seemed to drop several degrees. Several students were now actively backing away from Sarah's table, their instincts screaming warnings that their conscious minds couldn't understand. "Do you know what he said to me?" Sarah asked, turning her full attention to. "He said that if such a species truly existed, then perhaps there was still hope in the universe. And then he ordered his entire fleet to make a final stand against the Devourers, knowing they would all die, just to buy humanity time to prepare for what was coming." His face had gone pale. The recording function on his phone was still active, but his thumb hovered over the stop button as if he was finally beginning to understand that he might have pushed too far. "They all died," Sarah said simply. 12 billion, an entire civilization, extinct in a single day, because they believed that humans were worth saving, because they trusted my words about what we could become." The silence in the cafeteria was now absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work, drawn by the strange quality in Sarah's voice that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to something deeper in the human psyche. "So when you ask me about aliens," Sarah said, her voice returning to normal human frequencies but somehow carrying even more weight than before, "remember that there are beings out there who died believing that humanity was capable of greatness. Try not to prove them wrong." She gathered her belongings and walked toward the cafeteria exit, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. As she reached the doors, she paused and looked back at the sea of shocked faces. "The transport arrives in 5 hours, she said to no one in particular. "I'll be gone for a while. Try not to destroy the school while I'm away." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving 200 teenagers sitting in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Stood frozen at Sarah's abandoned table, his phone still recording empty air, his cruel confidence shattered by a truth too vast for his small world to contain. Sarah returned to school 4 months later on a Tuesday morning in spring, walking through the front entrance as if she had never left. The first person to spot her was Jenny, who dropped her textbooks in shock and immediately pulled out her phone to text. Within minutes, word had spread through the building like wildfire. Silent Sarah was back. But something fundamental had changed. The students who gathered in clusters to whisper about her return found themselves inexplicably reluctant to approach her directly. There was something different in her bearing, a weight to her presence that made even the most confident bullies think twice about their usual tactics. Found her at her old corner table in the cafeteria, sitting alone as always, but now the isolation seemed less like social awkwardness and more like the deliberate positioning of someone who preferred to observe rather than participate. Her lunch tray was untouched, and she was reading what appeared to be a scientific journal written in symbols that definitely weren't English. "Well, well," said, approaching her table with forced bravado. His usual crew followed at a greater distance than normal, their earlier enthusiasm for the game noticeably dampened. "Agent Sarah returns from her secret mission. How were your alien friends? Did you save the universe again?" Sarah looked up from her reading and felt his breath catch. Her eyes held something they hadn't possessed before, a depth of exhaustion and pain that seemed far too old for her 16-year-old face. But there was also something else, something that made him instinctively want to take a step backward. "Hello," Sarah said quietly. "I see you're still performing for your audience." Her voice was different too, carrying undertones that resonated in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Several students at nearby tables turned to look, drawn by frequencies their ears couldn't quite capture but their nervous systems registered as significant. "Yeah, well, some of us stayed here in the real world," replied, but his usual cruel confidence was notably absent. "Where did you really go? Some fancy mental health facility, private school for weird kids?" Sarah closed her journal and caught a glimpse of the cover. The symbols were definitely not from any Earth language, and they seemed to shift slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. His rational mind dismissed it as a trick of the light, but something deeper recognized the alien nature of what he was seeing. "I went to prevent a war," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "The contact crisis required immediate intervention. Their method of communication was causing reality distortions that threatened to collapse the quantum structure of local space-time." The cafeteria around them had grown quiet as students strained to listen. Felt trapped between his need to maintain his social position and a growing certainty that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. "Right," he said weakly. "More alien nonsense. You really need help, Sarah." Sarah studied him for a moment with those unsettling eyes. "Do you know what the taught me? They exist simultaneously across 11 dimensions, experiencing reality from perspectives that would shatter a human mind. But they have a concept that translates roughly as the cruelty of the small-minded." She stood slowly and was struck by how much presence she commanded despite being several inches shorter than him. "They've observed thousands of species across millions of years, and they've noticed that in every civilization there are always individuals who derive pleasure from causing pain to others, usually because their own existence feels meaningless." His face flushed red. "Are you calling me meaningless?" "I'm telling you what beings older than your entire species think about behavior like yours," Sarah replied calmly. "They find it predictable." The insult was delivered so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment to realize he'd been cut deeper than any of his own crude attacks had ever managed. Around them, students leaned forward, sensing a shift in the power dynamic they had observed for years. "You think you're better than everyone else," said, his voice rising with defensive anger. "You think your weird stories make you special." "I think," Sarah said, gathering her belongings, "that I've spent the last 4 months preventing the complete annihilation of human consciousness, and I'm too tired to pretend your opinion matters." She began walking toward the cafeteria exit, but wasn't done. The humiliation of being dismissed so completely in front of his audience drove him to desperation. "Fine," he shouted loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. "Prove it. If you're really some kind of secret agent alien talker, prove it right now. Show us something impossible." Sarah stopped walking. Around them, 200 students held their breath, phones raised and recording, waiting to see how the school's strangest mystery would resolve itself. Sarah turned back toward, and for the first time since returning, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You want proof?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," said, his bravado returning as he sensed his audience's attention. "Show us your superpowers, Agent Sarah. Talk to some aliens, do something impossible." Sarah reached into her backpack, and what appeared to be a small, crystalline device covered in the same shifting symbols as her journal. She placed it carefully on the table between them. "This is a quantum resonance communicator," she said conversationally. "It allows real-time communication across interstellar distances by manipulating entangled particles. They gave it to me as a gesture of respect after I successfully prevented their communication, attempts from accidentally erasing this solar system from existence." Stared at the device. It was beautiful in an unsettling way, seeming to contain depths that his eyes couldn't quite focus on. "That's just some fancy jewelry or something, probably from a costume shop." Sarah touched one of the symbols on the device's surface, and it immediately began to emit a soft, harmonic tone that made several students gasp and step backward. The air around the communicator shimmered slightly, and the fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker in a rhythmic pattern. "I'm now connected to the remnant fleet," Sarah announced to the silent cafeteria. "They're currently stationed in the system, monitoring Earth's development and waiting for humanity to achieve faster-than-light communication." She paused, appearing to listen to something only she could hear. "Admiral Ka sends his regards. He remembers our conversation about human potential and asks if we've managed to stop killing each other over trivial differences yet." His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The device was definitely doing something, the harmonic tones it produced creating interference patterns in the electronic equipment throughout the cafeteria. Several students' phones had begun displaying static, and the cash register at the lunch counter was cycling through random numbers. "This is impossible," whispered. "The Admiral is curious about human education systems," Sarah continued, still appearing to conduct a conversation with empty air. "He asks if we still allow our young to torment each other for entertainment, or if we've evolved beyond such primitive behaviors." The harmonic tones from the device were now causing visible vibrations in the windows, and several students had backed away to the far walls of the cafeteria. The air itself seemed to thicken around Sarah, as if reality was bending slightly to accommodate something it wasn't designed to contain. "I'm telling him that some humans have indeed evolved," Sarah said, her voice now carrying those impossible undertones that made the building's structure groan softly. "But others remain trapped in cycles of cruelty and ignorance, unable to comprehend their place in a universe far larger and more wonderful than they can imagine." Stumbled backward, his face gone white with shock and something approaching terror. "Stop it," he whispered. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." Sarah looked at him with something that might have been pity. "The Admiral offers an interesting perspective. He says that in his observations of developing civilizations, individuals who derive pleasure from causing suffering to others typically do so because they lack the imagination to conceive of their own potential for greatness." The communicator's tones reached a crescendo, and for a moment the entire cafeteria was filled with harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Students pressed their hands to their ears, overwhelmed by frequencies that bypassed normal hearing and spoke directly to their nervous systems. Then abruptly the sound stopped. Sarah touched the device again, and it returned to its inert crystalline state. The fluorescent lights stopped flickering, the phones returned to normal, and the oppressive weight in the air dissipated like fog in sunlight. "The Admiral says goodbye," Sarah announced to the room full of stunned teenagers. "He hopes that humanity will continue to surprise him with our capacity for growth and compassion." She placed the communicator back in her backpack and looked around the cafeteria at the sea of shocked faces. "For those of you recording this, you should know that the device generates electromagnetic interference that corrupts digital storage. Your phones captured nothing but static." It was true. Students throughout the room were staring at their phones in confusion, finding only corrupted files where they expected to have evidence of the impossible. "As for proof," Sarah said, turning back to one final time, "some things can't be proven to those who lack the capacity to understand them. But for those who do, She gestured around the room at the visible signs of what had just occurred. The scorch marks on the table where the communicator had sat, the fine cracks in several windows, the smell of ozone that lingered in the air. "The universe is vast and full of wonders," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence. "Most of you will never see even a fraction of what lies beyond this small world, but some of you might surprise me. Some of you might be capable of more than you imagine." She shouldered her backpack and walked toward the exit. As she reached the doors, she paused one final time. She said without turning around, "The next time you feel the need to torment someone for your entertainment, remember that you're sharing a universe with beings who could reshape reality with a thought. Try to be worthy of their restraint." The door closed behind her, leaving 200 teenagers in stunned silence, staring at the evidence of something impossible and trying to reconcile it with everything they thought they knew about their quiet, strange classmate. Stood frozen at Sarah's abandoned table, staring at the scorch marks that proved he had just witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Around him, his former audience dispersed in whispered conversations, no longer interested in his brand of cruel entertainment. Sarah Martinez walked down the empty hallway toward her next class, carrying the weight of cosmic secrets and the satisfaction of finally, just once, being able to share a glimpse of the truth with those who had never bothered to see her as anything more than a target for their amusement. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and she was its guardian. But today, for just a moment, she had also been a 16-year-old girl who had stood up to a bully and won. It was enough.